weekend tour following the Russian around. You could get anything you wanted in Vegas, easier if it was illegal. There were no cops in Vegas. I wasn't sure if there had ever been, but now that the cops and the spooks were at war, there wasn't a cop within 500 miles of the place. Romanov's was a dump from the outside. Pink gray stucco, bars on the windows, and weak jittery neon, set between happy ending bars and burlap window opium dens. Inside it was plush, red velvety material everywhere, brass on the bar. Although the waiters were all droids on wheels skimming across the floor with terrible efficiency, the bartender was a human in a a human in a black suit, bright-eyed and pasty-faced, speaking English like he'd memorized it off cards. He didn't like the look of me, but took his cigarette from his mouth long enough to saunter over and toss a napkin onto the bar. There was music in the air, a tinkling piano, and I could see my Russian in the mirror across from me, which was good enough. The bartender stopped in front of me, his dark hair hanging in his face. He picked tobacco off his lip and spat it onto the floor. "You have yen?" he asked. And I'll spare you and not do any accents, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. I smiled, tossing my credit dongle onto the bar. Sick with it. One thing I still had was yen. Problem was, you needed the fucking wheelbarrow of it to buy anything. He looked down at the dongle for a second, but didn't bother to pick it up and scan it. He sighed, almost in disappointment. "What will you have?" I liked his accent. It was hard to understand, but it sounded nice. He was Russian, of course, of some sort. Maybe he was Bulgarian, or maybe he was a fucking Cossack. It didn't matter. He was Russian for all practical purposes. Everyone in Vegas was Russian. They owned the city, if you wanted to call it a city. Mainly because no one else wanted the piece of shit out in the middle of nowhere. The Russians were keeping Vegas going through sheer determination, though things had gotten easier recently since the army had moved into the southwest. I hadn't seen a system cop in months. Doesn't matter. I can't taste anything anymore anyway. Gin, I said. Warm. He snorted, producing a glass and dropping it in front of me. Gin. Prol, huh? I winked, pulling a cigarette from my pocket. Fucking right. My Russian was an old guy, short but broad in the shoulders, with the tight look of a man who'd been lean and tough his whole life. He was old, silvery hair, thick and short on his head. In the mirror, he was sitting at a table crowded by two tall, plump baldies who sweated freely in their standard-issue leather coats. My Russian was clasping the hands of a tall, thin man with waxy skin and a shiny suit, the owner. They were beaming at each other so forcefully, pumping hands, I wondered which one hated the other more. The dining room was pretty full, lots of swells out for a nice meal, mostly fat men in suits so fucking pretty they were almost clowns. There was a nice buzz of noise in the air. The bartender poured my drink and I lit my cigarette, sending a cloud of bluish smoke into the air. I picked up my glass and swallowed the drink in one gulp, ticking my head down toward the glass before he could put the bottle away. "Another," I said. "You really can't taste anything, huh?" he said, squinting at me and pouring another. "Or feel anything." He shook his head. Bullshit. In the mirror, I watched the tall, waxy guy walk away from my Russian and plucked my cigarette from my mouth. I pushed the red coal against the top of my right hand and held it there, white smoke curling up. I counted 5, watching my Russian in the mirror sweep the room with his tiny, thin eyes, and then put the butt back in my mouth, waving my hand at the bartender to show off the blackened welt. Not a thing. "That's impressive," the bartender nodded, leaving the bottle on the bar as a sign of good humor. "Nerve augment?" I shook my head, picking up my glass and staring into the cloudy liquid. "Something that happened to me in prison," I said slowly, one of my moments coming on me, a strange, slow feeling in my thoughts. I shook my head a little and let it slide past me. It only got worse if I tried to force a memory. I don't like to talk about it. I toasted him and drank my shot off as he spun and walked away. As I was setting the glass down, I felt the air around me getting crowded. In the mirror, my Russian and his 2 sweaty bodyguards had suddenly gotten much nearer. "My friend," my Russian said, "I have been seeing visions of you all day." He spoke with the weird precision foreigners brought to English, every word bitten off, newly minted, invented a few seconds ago. "Why is that?" I returned my cigarette to my mouth. Without looking around at them, I shrugged. "I've been hired to kill you." In the mirror, my Russian shot his cuffs, and I caught a glimpse of a dark, blurry skull tattoo on his wrist. Fucking Ivans and their bullshit. The Russians had been just about the only organization to survive unification, and it had made them fucking batty with the symbols and rituals. It wasn't pretty, of course. They made most of their yen through drugs, heavy shit sold to the bottom rung in the system, mostly designer, unstable, and as likely to pop a vessel as get you high. The cops had no patience for narcotics. Dick Marin, director of internal affairs and pretty much king of the cops, set the tone there, and they beat up on the Russians every chance they got, and the Russians were quick to put a bullet in the head of anyone who looked like a weak link to them. They'd never made much of a dent in New York, back when there'd been a New York. The locals had closed ranks against them, and the system pigs owned New York the way the Russians owned Vegas. There had been a couple of attempts over the years, but it had ended in tears. But the Russians had survived. Everyone in that organization had done terrible things. Terrible Things was their initiation rite. My Russian cocked his head at me for a moment and then burst into laughter. His two bald friends joined in after a second of hesitation. Their boss looked around as if he'd made a terribly funny joke, soaking up the room. Come have a drink with me, my ghost, he chuckled, turning away. Talk to me. One of the bald giants leaned down, but I forestalled that bullshit by standing up, blowing smoke around. Touch me, Boris, and I will break a finger. He grunted, straightening up. Name not Boris. I nodded. Finger will still be broken, I advised, pushing through them. I jerked my head at my bartender, who was back to leaning against the wall, watching me walk by with slitted eyes and smoke curling up from his own cigarette. He flicked his hand from his waistband, and my credit dongle leaped at me. I snatched it from the air. Spasiba, I said, just a collection of sounds I'd learned. I tucked my dongle away into my pocket. Nice knowing you, he said to my back. I grinned. The place was air-conditioned aggressively, but I imagined I could still sense the heat out in the desert. It had been 113 at noon, though it was expected to cool down to a manageable 104 by midnight. I hated Las Vegas. It was like living in someone's armpit. They led me toward the back, passing the packed tables, and kept walking past all of the heavy-looking red padded doors marked private, and took me through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The black humming cooking unit took up an immense amount of space, swollen within the tiled room, just a cube of rough black metal with neat, tidy conveyor belts inching out of it. It was idle at the moment, there being more activity at the bar than the menus, but I didn't like the way it hummed, an almost silent vibration that reached inside me. I pushed my hands into the loose pockets of my ill-fitting suit, too heavy for the weather and full of my sweat, soaked up lovingly and held jealously. I wasn't made for this town. Too hot, too empty, too old. My Russian kept walking through the empty kitchen and out the back door into a fenced-in lot that smelled like rot, the wet, heavy smell hitting you in the face and settling down to soak into your clothes and skin. Weeks from now, I'd be smelling like this parking lot. I kept smiling, though, trying to look my new friends over. All of us thought we knew exactly where this social call was ending, and all that remained was to see who was right. I put my eyes on my Russian and ran them up and down his shiny suit, deciding he wasn't carrying a barker. The Russians, the higher-ups at least, the real old-school Ivans, had a fetish for strangulation, a wire shining out in the darkness. I'd heard they regarded any murder that didn't require you to get right up close to the mark, a knife, a piano string, was pussy work. American murder. Pussy or not, the two bald mountains had two guns each, big ones, under their arms. They didn't look fast, and their coats were too tight for that kind of move. It would bunch up if they tried to pull both at once, and if they were going to pull them one at a time, they were morons for carrying two anyway. The two bodyguards stopped and let my Russian and me take a few steps more, so that I ended up between him and them, the two huge balls of flesh between me and the door. My Russian stopped and turned to smile back at me. I squinted around, the dark heat settling on my shoulders and pushing. It was bright out, a big moon shining down on us. The fence looked high, a serious fence, not impossible to scale, but not something I was going to leap over while people shot at me. The sky was a dark blue canopy over us, empty, clear, just filled with evaporating heat. I take meetings here, my Russian said, spreading his hands and grinning. His suit shone expensively in the dim light leaking from the sky. It is quiet. So, you have been hired to kill me. Who has hired you? Why? He cocked his head. I know your face. I know your name. New York, yes? Lots of you New Yorkers out here these days. Rats fleeing the sinking ship. New York's gone, I said. They're tearing it down and replacing it with a goddamn shopping mall. Yes, I know. I know you. A big gun, yes? How many men have you killed for yen? He said it as if there were better things to kill for. Then he squinted one eye at me owlishly. You were in Venice recently, yes? The World Banker. I forget the name. I shook my head. Haven't been to Europe in years, Boris. You're thinking of some other desperate old man. My Russian frowned and pushed his hands back into his pockets. From below his collar a smudge of ink was visible, a star atop what I assumed was a crown, the symbol of high rank. I reached up and scratched my shoulder, where my own prison tattoo used to burn. Prison had been good for me. I didn't like to think about it too much, about Michelin and Bartlett and the others. It hadn't been a good time, an enjoyable time, but it had been a necessary time, for me. It had boiled me down, and I'd come out of it a better man. He saw me looking and smiled. You know what it means? He suddenly jerked his sleeve up, revealing 2.5 of the blurry skull tats on his arms. And these? Prison work, I said, keeping myself still, feeling the bodyguard's eyes on me. Where'd you get the art? You know what it means, my friend? I smirked, figuring that would annoy him. I know what it's supposed to mean. Anyone can slap some ink on you. My name is not Boris, he complained. Maybe he wasn't as smart as me after all. I wasn't used to being the smartest guy in the room. And where I come from, they kill you for false emblems like that. Buy you a drink somewhere and slit your throat, you fall back onto a plastic sheet. 5 minutes later, it's like you were never there. Yeah, I said.